Hello and welcome to the Encephalitis Podcast. My name is Prav and I'm from Encephalitis International. Today we'll be talking about the depiction of encephalitis in films, focusing specifically on the 2011 film Contagion, in which a fictional virus modeled after the real-world Nipah virus caused a pandemic with neurological symptoms. Partly inspired by the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s, the film gained renewed interest during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm grateful to be speaking to the writer of the film, Mr. Scott Z. Burns, or Mr. Scott Z. Burns. Mr. Scott Z. Burns is an award-winning screenwriter, director, producer, and playwright. He has written screenplays for a number of well-known films, including The Bourne Ultimatum, 2007, The Informant, 2009, Side Effects, 2013, The Report, 2019, and, of course, Contagion, 2011. More recently, he created the Apple TV Plus series Extrapolations in 2023. He is a frequent collaborator with actor Matt Damon and director Steven Soderbergh. He has also produced the Academy Award-winning film An Inconvenient Truth in 2006. We are very delighted to have Mr. Scott Z. Burns on the podcast. Mr. Burns, or Scott as I know you, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
How are you doing today? I know you just woke up, I think.
No, I've been up for a little bit. Had to take the dogs out, and the dogs will be back soon. So from their second walk of the day. So I'll have to jump off for a minute and get them back in and situated.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. Yeah, dog schedule first. Brilliant. So thank you so much for being here. And just to start off, could you begin by telling us about why you decided to write the film Contagion?
You know, the story actually has quite a bit to do with my father, who oddly died right at the very beginning of the COVID outbreak. Not of COVID, he died of Alzheimer's. But my dad always was fascinated by novel viruses. And he was a psychologist. He had been a research psychologist. He did his graduate work at McGill University in Montreal. And my dad sometimes at breakfast would look at the New York Times and read to me stories about novel viruses. And, we would talk about how long until a virus was able to go, not just from, a reservoir species into a human, but when it started going human to human, and what that might mean to the world. And so it had been something that I had, more than just a passing interest about it. It had been something that was around the breakfast table in my family before my dad eventually found his way to the New York Times crossword puzzle. And so there was a moment in time where Steven Soderbergh and I, after we had done a movie called The Informant, we're talking about what we should do next. And we had one idea to do a movie, oddly, about Leni Riefenstahl. And then I got a call from Steven just before the meeting. And he said, you know what? Nobody wants to see this movie. Our friends won't even go. So let's pivot. Do you have anything else? So I went into this meeting with Steven and I pitched the idea of a pandemic movie that was very much to be rooted in science. And after that, Michael Schamberg and Stacey Scher, who were the producers, and I went on this sort of extended field trip. And it started with a guy named Larry Brilliant in San Francisco, and Larry had been very involved, as you probably are aware, in he was part of the team that eradicated smallpox and chased the last case of that off the planet. And Larry introduced me to a guy in New York at Columbia University named Ian Lipkin. And since then, Ian and I have become very close. But at the time, the deal we made is that I would try and write a movie that was honest and as honest and truthful as possible, and that I wanted the scientists and public health workers to really be the heroes. I wanted them to be the people who had to overcome, commerce and public indifference and other things, that especially seem to become problematic around this time of year when influenza and other sort of communicable diseases are peaking. But so are opportunities for people to go shopping and for them to go and gather. And that became an interesting area for me to explore. And so, Ian kind of told me about SARS and how he had kind of learned of its origins and about these wet markets in Southeast Asia, where one species of animal might be kept next to another one, and if one of them was sick, that it could very quickly find its way into the human population. And that appears to be the case with SARS and a civet cat. And so we began thinking about how something as fundamental as commercial expansion, as the development of a rainforest, as the end of the movie talks about, where someone chops down a tree that a bat was roosting in, and the bat has to go find another place to live, and it ends up dropping a piece of fruit that a pig gnaws on, and as they say in your country, and Bob's your uncle.
Yeah.
And so that became kind of the framework for what we built the entire movie on.
Right. I mean, I'm really actually quite surprised about the beginning of your answer where you talked about your father. And I just wanted to ask, like, what did you think of the film when it did come out?
My dad really liked the movie. Obviously, and people don't remember this, when it came out, it did well. I think we won our opening weekend, and I think what was interesting was the opening of the movie was good. We didn't, I think we thought it would all do a lot better than it did. It made its money back. It did everything that you hope a feature film will do. And so that was good. We took it to the Venice Film Festival. We took it to Toronto. We did all the things you do with the new movie. And Stephen had really wanted to make it feel like a disaster film. And so we talked quite a bit about the Poseidon Adventure and other movies that were disaster films that dealt with big starry casts where you weren't afraid to kill, movie stars. And obviously in our film, we killed Gwyneth Paltrow in, the first 10 minutes, and go from there. And so, we understood what we were doing within the genre. And then, a number of years later, when the pandemic began, Ian Lipkin actually called me right around the end of December of that year to say that he was going to China and that there was something going on there that was alarming. So Ian was way ahead of this. And then in January, Ian called me and asked me if I would appear with him on Fox News in New York City. And I was not available. So Ian went, and we believe, obviously, we can't prove it, but the sound man at Fox News, when putting on Ian's lav, seemed to give him COVID. So Ian was very, very sick in February of that year, just as people were beginning to get interested in COVID. And my dad died the last day of February. It was a leap year. And so, that in retrospect, I think was a great relief to me, because my father at that point was in hospice, and I can't imagine how hospice visits would have been managed in the early days of the pandemic. I actually flew up from Los Angeles to San Francisco to say goodbye, and I wore a mask on that flight. And at the
Mhm.
time, almost nobody was wearing, masks in America. And I remember walking through the airport, wondering to myself, how different might this look in another month or two? So, you know, it gave the movie a second life.
Mhm.
Um, and we immediately reached out to our cast and asked them to do public service announcements about washing your hands and about other things that you can do to prevent or at least slow the spread of SARS, or of COVID-19. And so it was, it was a very rough, complicated moment for me as time went on. And it's interesting because when the movie first appeared, we showed it to Dr. Anthony Fauci. And Anthony Fauci said, "Wow, the science seems really solid. The only issue I have is with the amount of time it takes for a vaccine. It seems like it happens really fast." And I was a little bit frustrated with that because we don't really talk about the time period in the movie. There's just sort of an ellipsis. And we come back to the movie because there's been a vaccine discovered. So I was like, you can't actually tell me what the movie is saying. But, the astonishing thing that did happen was that, we were able to come up with a vaccine. And so Anthony Fauci's big complaint about Contagion, the movie, was that we seemed to suggest that it wouldn't take that long to come up with a vaccine. Obviously, because of the research and the development that already existed about using RNA as a platform, the vaccine was developed much more quickly than I think probably any vaccine in history, which ended up being a very mixed blessing for the world because it gave some people reason to be suspicious of it. I ended up working with Dr. Lipkin again when it became available, and we had a very interesting conversation about, Ian said, "Well, you need to get Matt Damon and other famous people to come and get vaccinated." And I said, "I think that's going to work against us. I think that rather than showing rich, wealthy people getting vaccinated, wealthy, famous people getting vaccinated, we should try and have familiar people who, work in the community." And so I started a campaign with Ian and Columbia University called Roll Up Your Sleeves New York, um, about getting vaccinated, and also about rebuilding New York City as a viable city that could go back to work. So that was my experience with vaccines. And the movie itself has ended up having a very long tail, I think, for all of us, where I mean, COVID isn't completely gone, and there obviously it's a very complicated virus. So anyway, that's that was kind of my adventure around COVID. That and the
Yeah.
fact that I also ended up getting COVID 3 or 4 times. The first time I got it was in June, and I had a really extraordinary reaction to it and ended up in hospital in Southern California at a time when um, people were still trying to figure out how to treat it. And it was a terrifying time to be in a hospital. I was, sleeping on an air mattress, and in a room that wasn't a hospital room, and everybody would have to come in hazmat suits to bring me food or treat me. It was a very frightening few days.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. And I do want to talk about the human side of these conditions, and that's something that you did write in your films, because in addition to the neurological consequences of the infection in Contagion, such as seizures and confusion, the film also depicted how family members deal with the consequences, such as Matt Damon's character, who, of course, lost his wife and son. So, how did you go about writing this side of the condition?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to a lot of ER docs about what those conversations would be, and what the experience of a human being is when you see your partner decompensate right in front of you, and there's nothing you can do. And you take them to the hospital, and you're very much in their space, and you expose yourself to them, or whatever sort of intimacy has filled your life, with them, and you know you're suddenly told. I mean, it was very interesting. The scene with where the ER doc tells Matt Damon that Gwyneth Paltrow has died was really basically transcribed from an exchange that an ER doctor told me, he had had with somebody in a similar situation, where they just couldn't grasp that that person was gone. Their reaction was, okay, can I go and see them now? And it's staggering, to think about how that would feel, for someone that you loved so much to be taken from you, and then on the heels of that, to have your child also die for the same reason, that Gwyneth had been a loving mother and tucked the child in, and kissed him goodnight, even though she was starting to not feel well. And I think, anybody who lives, I mean, basically all of us recognize that the intimacy that's part of our day-to-day experience of life, and what makes it interesting and rewarding and comfortable to be here on the planet, is the time we share with each other. And when that becomes a weapon, I think it tells you just how opportunistic these viruses are. It was always interesting to me in my conversations with Ian, and even a doctor who I worked with briefly at Stanford, a guy named Nathan Wolfe. Nathan would talk about, the virus almost like it was a living being. And so would Larry Brilliant, that it would look at the behavior of the host organism and look for opportunities to jump into another meal, basically, that we were just, big, meals walking around waiting for the virus to, take over another cell. And that really opened up my mind to how these things function and behave, whether it's, remember Ian very famously had been on Fox News, and someone asked him about Ebola. And it was at a time when there was a couple of cases of Ebola in New York, and the host was Bill O'Reilly, and Ian, the guy said, well, should I be worried if the person on the subway next to me has Ebola and they throw up on me? And Ian said, well, you should definitely be worried and upset that the person on the subway just threw up on you. But they may not have Ebola. Not everybody who's throwing up, has Ebola. And I just want to say this about Ian, who is heroic to me in a number of ways, but the great thing about Ian is he's not afraid to go on Fox News because he knows that the cohort of humans that watch Fox News are not people who necessarily are getting great guidance in terms of science. And, that was bad during Trump 1, now during the second thing with, our dismantled, healthcare system. It's really, really frightening to see, vaccines being taken away and vaccines being besmirched, in public discourse, and it's frustrating to me as someone who is kind of a fan of science to see science being so grossly misunderstood that, I think it was Laurie Garrett who wrote the book The Coming Plague and was also one of my consultants on the movie. And Laurie would talk about how, science is frequently wrong for a period of time, or in part wrong. And when we had the pressure of a virus walking around, going around the planet, killing people, of course there were going to be moments where we were wrong. And the media did a horrible job of, helping people understand the empirical method and how one has to deal with these things, both in a lab and in the world. And the virus was changing very, very quickly. And there were different variants, and human beings were all different. And so, there are all of these things that make the science vulnerable. And when you have, 10 million people get vaccinated and 2 get sick, the only stories we're going to hear about are the 2 people who got sick. There's a very famous story I was told many years ago by a marine biologist that, when somebody falls overboard on a boat and a dolphin swims by, dolphins have a tendency to knock another warm-blooded animal to the surface because that's what they do with baby dolphins. So some percentage of the time, they knock the human being who fell overboard to shore, and the person gets out and goes to the paper and tells the story about how the dolphin saved their life. The other 50% of the time, the person gets knocked further out to sea and drowns and doesn't tell a story. And I think the exact same thing happens with vaccinations. We tend to be more excited, and our interests become very prurient about, oh my God, somebody died from this vaccine, or someone took the vaccine and got sick anyway, ergo the vaccine doesn't work. And those things are huge problems for scientists who are so immersed and aware of the methods that they use that I think they were shocked during COVID to hear the criticisms that they received, because for them, it's always a numbers game. And Larry Brilliant will often say, that we have a real problem in our society because, there are parents who can only take a kid to get vaccinated, once every 6 months. So you have your young person and you take them to the doctor, and the doctor's afraid that you won't be able to get childcare or that you won't be able to get off work. And so you've got this kid there, and yeah, they probably give them more vaccines than they should because they don't know when they're going to see that kid again. And so whose fault is that? Is that the fault of the practitioner? Is that the fault of our society that we don't allow time for people to take their children to doctors? And it's out of things like that, Ian Lipkin and I have spent a lot of time discussing this real anti-vax problem we have with MMR. And in America right now, we're seeing, I think, 3 major measles outbreaks because now there are people who, who are not getting their children vaccinated. And so this disease, which we never encountered, we're now encountering all over. And it's because of, a real basic misunderstanding about correlation and causality. From what I understand, autism tends to develop right around the same time when people are given, these vaccines. And so there is no causal thing that I've ever heard any scientists talk about with MMR and autism. And yet you have RFK Jr., maintaining that that is exactly what's happening. And, in California, there were laws saying you couldn't send your kid to a public school if they weren't adequately vaccinated. And now we're seeing laws like that repealed all over America. And that endangers the community. Those kids come home. Their parents frequently have, immune systems that have all sorts of, comorbidities and issues. And we're going to make each other really, really sick. And that's terrifying to me, like one of the scariest things.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There's so much in that answer, Scott, that I could, so many different directions we could go on. For example, the media direction, which I will ask about later.
Yeah.
But before that, in a separate interview, you had said that you wanted, and even in this interview, you said that you wanted public health workers and scientists to be the heroes of the story. And I was wondering, in addition to the conversation you mentioned about with the ER doctor, what made you want to write a script where such characters would be central?
Because first of all, on a personal level, I find the work that people in healthcare, especially in public healthcare, the work that they do, so honorable and so essential, and so critical and really profoundly moving. We went to, CDC, during the Obama administration, and those people really cared. There's a story that I like to tell where, Kate Winslet had met with an EIS officer when she was there, and, then she was having a conversation with the producers who were, talking about her wardrobe. And Kate was like, I don't think that, the person I just met with dresses in fancy clothes, and I don't think they care about their roots and get their hair dyed all the time. Like, I want to be who I just spoke to. I want to be somebody who really cares about stopping a pandemic and keeping people safe during one. Not somebody who, and at the time, Kate Winslet, was somebody who, was in the movie because, we wanted fancy actresses, and it was, kind of from a movie standpoint, frightening to the producers that she wasn't going to be wearing designer clothes. But, I think Kate or any of the people who were involved in the film were really touched by the integrity with which the healthcare workers that we met did their jobs. Even working, a couple of years ago on extrapolations, Ian had introduced me to Kiran Thakur, and, who is just a brilliant doctor at Columbia. And Dr. Thakur helped me in these conversations we had about neurology and climate change, and neurology and what it, how fetal development for someone who is pregnant during a period where there are extreme heat days, how that might be lived out, and what that looks longitudinally like for that child when they're born. So again, it's not just the scientist who discovers this. it's everybody. It's the nurses who are going to have to be with those people on a day-to-day basis. It's the educators who are now going to have to figure out ways to educate people who have, cognitive compromises and other issues. It spreads out throughout our society in so many ways. And that's why I think it's critical that we recognize these people. And, you don't really see them as heroes. And I wanted that. I mean, in Contagion, there's a scene that Kate Winslet does in front of, the governor's lackeys in the state of Minnesota, and they want to keep stores open, and they want to, and she walks them through the R naught of the virus. And that was such a fun scene. And Kate was wonderful to work with because she didn't understand it at all. And at first, Ian sat down and tried to explain it to her, and I could tell that she just wasn't, taking it in. So she and I spent a lot of time together going through the math of an R naught and really coming to understand, how these rates of transmissibility account for how an individual case becomes, a pandemic and an epidemic, or an epidemic and then a pandemic.
Wow, that's such a brilliant story. I mean, later on, I'm going to ask you about the merging of the science and the art, and I think that story really encapsulates it. That's absolutely brilliant. And yeah, thank you so much. And thank you also for mentioning Professor Kieran Theko, who was also actually a guest on the Encephalitis podcast.
Oh.
So for our audience members, please do watch that episode. But yeah, an incredible doctor and the scientist. And
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, she was so wonderful to work with and so thoughtful, and is one of these extraordinary people who seems to understand storytelling and filmmaking and science on a level that's very, very, very rare.
Absolutely. Yeah. And hopefully, yeah, continued work as well with Dr. Thakur. Yeah, just moving on to, as I promised, the media question. One aspect of Contagion is Jude Law's character and the importance of science communication and trust in experts, which of course Jude Law's character wasn't.
Yeah.
What have you learned about the importance of communicating medical information responsibly, particularly in the current climate of dis and misinformation, as well as social media and, of course, AI?
Thank you for that question. Look, I was very, very proud of Jude's character as an idea. And at the time, I think Elliot Gould says something about blogging, saying that, blogging is graffiti with punctuation or something, and which I didn't mean as any sort of diss on graffiti. But I think what we've seen, especially with this pandemic and with the rise of podcasting and the rise of social media, is that, again, we tend to be drawn to the stories that are the outliers, because if you're running a 24/7 news organization, you want to tell the story that's going to get people to tune in. And you don't tend to, focus on the times people didn't get sick from the vaccine and all of the kids who don't end up getting autism. And so I think that's a real issue. Years ago, before he passed away, I was on a Zoom during the pandemic with Daniel Kahneman, and he spoke very eloquently about, if the newspapers were really covering the world around us, the front page would be filled with, heart attacks and diabetes and, car accidents and suicides. And the things that are the most prevalent in our world. But, when you have news organizations chasing eyeballs, you tend to go for these extreme stories. And I think that's even worse by about a magnitude of 10 with individuals who are, trying to support themselves with their podcast, and who go and, are endorsing products that are scientifically unproven and are appealing to audiences that want to hear their belief in misinformation confirmed, or who have political agendas that really feed on disinformation. And so you see, what at one time was just, Jude's character, blogging about forsythia. And then you look at what happened during COVID, and people are peddling, bogus cures and other kinds of claims and things that are scientifically untested. And now those people, have gone from being these fringe players to actually being our government. And generally, I think if you peel a layer or two of that onion, you'll find that it's about making money. And I find making money off of people who, are not necessarily as well educated, and who now are going to get sick and potentially die from what you're telling them, to be something that I find criminal. But we're giving those people, the microphone right now instead of, handcuffing them.
Yeah. And staying slightly on the subject, but moving on to encephalitis as well, how did you go about fact checking for the film? And were there any physicians or scientists from the encephalitis world who helped?
No, Ian actually was on set with us for most days, and I worked very closely with Ian and his lab, really, really, doing the work of sequencing the virus. So it was kind of a hybrid of Nipah and Hendra, that we figured out, and it's the kind of thing that, let's hope it never appears in nature, but it's not inconceivable that it could. I think the great thing that I learned from my scientists is, Ian said, look, a virus has a strategy to survive, and that strategy can, basically be anything. And they're weird things in the world. It's like they're not technically living beings. They don't do any of the things that we generally associate with life on Earth. They take over a cell and turn it into themselves. And Ian and I have had endless conversations about, are they bad copying machines intentionally so that, they're not easy to sort out? Or are they bad copying machines because they're, primitive? And it's very interesting philosophically to contemplate a lot of these issues. But, again, most of us don't understand them, and they don't understand that some of them are actually, not bad for us, and they're working away in your gut right now, doing good things for you. So, it's complicated. And I certainly don't understand it. For a long time, I wouldn't agree to come on a thing like this without a scientist coming with me, because I would always say to CNN or whomever, or MSNBC, like, I'm a screenwriter. You need to listen to a scientist. You need to listen to a physician, not a screenwriter, especially during COVID, because it had been, 8-9 years since I'd written the movie. And I didn't even, I'd written a lot of other movies since then. So you tend not to always retain the things that you're not using. So look, I think we need to do such a better job of making sure that when you are writing a movie about something that is factual, that you stay close to the science and you don't mislead people. Otherwise, the movie industry is guilty of the same things that, that other people are doing.
Amazing. Yeah. Entertaining and just responsible and dutiful. I love that so much. And I do want to talk about your more recent work. For
Yes.
example, Extrapolations, which focuses heavily on the climate crisis, much like your earlier work on An Inconvenient Truth. We know that climate change is contributing to the spread of vector-borne encephalitis. Do you see a need for more storytelling that specifically highlights the link between a changing planet and our health?
Yes. Yeah, I think where where my head is at now with this is that some of the blame has to be taken on by the environmental movement. And what I mean by that is we need to stop talking about climate stories. We need to stop referring to them that way. They're just stories. They It's easy to do kind of the first order climate story about somebody who, stands against some kind of development or is trying to preserve some aspect of nature. I think what I long for are these second, third, and fourth order effects of the way we live on the planet, and issues around that. How it's funny, I've never heard someone say encephalitis before, and I'm like, oh, okay, we say encephalitis here. But it's interesting. When I was growing up in Minnesota, I remember there would be outbreaks of encephalitis when like a hockey team would go and play, and you'd have people in a closed space, and it was sort of a perfect situation for the disease to spread. I think you need to look at how warming up a system and adding more humidity to a system and all of these other things are going to result in, in these diseases appearing more and more frequently. And not call it a climate story, just tell the story and allow the facts of the story to help people understand that as we change the world, we are creating opportunities for some species. Usually they're the ones that are not going to help us very much, while we're also killing off other species. And so, I know even from An Inconvenient Truth, that Nairobi was settled where it is because it was above the mosquito band. And as it's warm, the mosquito band has now come up. And so there is more malaria now in these places. Or you look at, the encroachment of mosquitoes carrying, Zika into Florida, or even, yellow fever in Chicago or here in New York City during an extended summer. And so disease vectors are going to increase. And, we're doing that at the same time that we're, killing off birds with, a whole host of things. And so the things that might feed on the mosquitoes are also, imperiled. So I do want there to be a lot more storytelling around exactly that we need to be aware that our actions are causing these things. We need to connect dots that when when you buy a big gas guzzling car, as people continue to do here in America, you're making, the atmosphere thicker, and that means that it'll get warmer. And that means that there'll be more mosquitoes. And, we're not, I don't know that we need to explain and connect all those dots. I think we just need to tell the stories about what is happening as a result of our behavior and allow, the media and other people to help figure it out.
Absolutely. And relating to this, in a separate interview, you talked about writing a possible sequel for Contagion. And I was
Yeah.
wondering what led you to this, and can we expect a sequel?
Well, the reason that I did that podcast, it's called What Could Go Wrong, and it's on Audible, is initially I wanted to work with AI. And I thought, shouldn't AI be able to help us figure out where the next pandemic is likely to come from, and how, and what reservoir animals, um, and shouldn't it also be able to help us look at our society and think about how it's going to move? And we deal with that a little bit in my podcast, but then we also needed to pick an idea for a virus. And oddly, this AI and I came up with something pretty interesting about microplastics. And so, yeah, I'm not sure yet if I'm going to write that, but it's definitely on the list. And I think that we need, again, to look at not necessarily telling a climate story, telling a story that has, implications beyond where we're anticipating, that these stories, and weirdly, Jude Law's character is actually in our sequel, but now he's a congressman from Florida. So, like, I think we need to have a much better understanding of not just how viruses move, but how information now moves through our culture.
That's such a brilliant development to Jude Law's character, and yeah, that's so exciting. And I didn't expect microplastics, so yeah, very intriguing, Scott. And looking forward to that. Yeah, coming towards the end now. What have my final question is: what have you learned about the merging of science of medicine with the art of storytelling?
I think it's always been a part, looking back at some of the books I loved growing up, science fiction by Jules Verne and George Orwell, and, moving forward into people even like Ray Bradbury, and now Kim Stanley Robinson, who writes quite a bit about the environment. I think there's always been an opportunity in writing to look at our society and wonder how it might be different. And usually I think writers do that by thinking what could go wrong. And how a thing that we think is going to make life better might at some point make life very much worse. So I do think that the two are belong together. I think we need scientists to help us enhance our understanding of the world around us. And I think we need, artists and writers and filmmakers to help us contemplate what the problems are likely to be with an enhanced understanding and with the changes that science and now technology are going to bring. There are some wonderful things about AI, but there are also a lot of people who are going to use AI to, to take jobs away from people, especially in the arts. When you have an AI that can write a song and you have an audience that isn't really savvy enough to understand, the difference between machine-made music, or even in the film business, where you now will probably start, if we're not already seeing AI-generated plot lines, like what becomes of screenwriters and other people. And look, a lot of the times, I don't know that there's a difference between an AI generated thing and um, you know, a human generated screenplay. But I think, you know, there's always going to be something that a human brings to a piece of art that I don't think a machine will.
Brilliant. I completely agree. Thank you so much. And we have come to the end of the podcast, and I just wanted to finish off before closing, just to ask if there is anything that we have not discussed that you would like to mention. We have talked about a lot of different
Yeah,
topics.
no, I'm like, you know, my unfortunate fandom for Tottenham. That's about it.
Oh, brilliant. I'm an Arsenal supporter, so I'm not, I won't broach the subject much longer. But yeah, well, thank you so much for doing this podcast with us. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Great. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
That was Mr. Scott Z. Burns, or Mr. Scott Z. Burns, award-winning screenwriter, director, producer, playwright, and writer of the 2011 film Contagion. And finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for listening and watching. If you have been affected by any of the issues raised wherever you live in the world, please contact our support services. Encephalitis International is here to help in whatever way we can to achieve our aim of ending death and disability from encephalitis. For all our information, as well as details on how to donate, please visit encephalitis.info/donate. Thank you again, and see you next time on the Encephalitis Podcast.
Great. Thank you so much.